as the Templars had been moving pilgrims to the Holy Land, they had to develop massive ships, fleets of ships, in order to move people and supplies and food and cargo to these locations. They set up ports in areas of La Rochelle in France, as well as in Portugal, and they sailed all over Europe and down into Jerusalem and into Africa. This was known history. What is lesser known is that through their discoveries of the ancient maps, they also began to develop secret passages to the New World of the Americas. Leaving from Portugal and La Rochelle in France, the Templars would sail up through Scotland, over Greenland, Iceland, down through Nova Scotia, and eventually all the way down along the eastern coast of North America, as far south as Panama. They did explorations mapping all of North America. While doing this, they established relations with a number of the tribes that were living in these areas. And they came to learn to recognize each other with a secret handshake that both sides would know. The Templars also had engaged in secret initiation rites. These initiation rites, amongst other things, involved taking a candidate and putting them through a symbolic death and raising ceremony that fell in line with their own gnostic beliefs, where the person had to symbolically die to their old life and were raised to a new light of understanding. One of the things that they found, particularly as they traveled down into the areas of Central America, in what would now be modern Mexico today, was they encountered Nahuatl cultures. These Nahuatl cultures, which included the Mayan and the Aztec traditions in the region, had their own initiation rites and ceremonies, their own architecture. They had been building with pyramids, much like the Templars had encountered in Egypt. And so, as the Templars encountered this, they found this as proof of the ideas of this lost civilization of Atlantis that the Templars had become exposed to. Not only that, but the word that the Nahuatl cultures used for their ancient homeland was Atlan. And Atlan, they said, was an advanced civilization that they had come from that had been wiped out by a cataclysm, and that the people, the Nahuatl culture, had escaped on boats from this cataclysm and then settled in the area of the Americas. Well, it wasn't too far of a stretch to find that Atlan was a lot like Atlantis that Plato talked about. So this was quite a revelation. So even to this day, if you go and you look at the artwork of these different native tribes in the region, it is not uncommon to find the red Templar cross, equal armed cross, being used by all of these tribes because of their close association with the Templars. And while they did this, they exchanged this secret hand grip, which to this day is still being used by these native tribes and by the Templars. It's the same grip. One of the other symbols that was used by the Templars, and that you also find being used by these cultures, including the Nahuatl cultures, was the symbol of the squared circle. This symbol was to the Templars, was a symbol for the philosopher's stone of alchemy. The square represented physical reality, and the circle represented spiritual reality. And as they come together, it represented spiritualizing the material and materializing the spiritual. The same meaning for their Templar crosses that they wore on their chests. Another way of depicting this symbol of the square and the circle coming together was the implements of the square and the compasses that has now become associated with Freemasonry. In the earliest temples of Templars, including the Church of St. Sergius and Bacchus in Constantinople, where Hugh de Payens and Godfrey de St. Omer were initiated, on the pillars in this building to this day can still be found the square and compasses next to an Egyptian ankh. And this alludes to this tradition that the Templars had inherited. The other symbol that was common was the symbol of the trident. This was a symbol that was associated with Poseidon in antiquity, and who was believed to be the god of Atlantis. This symbol of the trident was something that the Templars also used as a symbol. In fact, to this day, the Grand Master of the Templars has this symbol present with him when he speaks in a temple. One of the structures that the Templars built in Europe after their travels to the New World was a chapel in northern Scotland known as Rosin Chapel, not far from Edinburgh. Rosin Chapel has within it a number of ideas from the philosophies of the Templars, but some of the most important things that are found in there that is beyond the most people seems to miss is the fact that there are aloe cactus and American corn carved into the arches at Rosin Chapel. There's also a flower, it's a trefoil flower, which is a 3-petaled flower that can be found carved in the Rosin Chapel, and the only place you can find this is in North America. Not only this, if this were not enough, also found throughout Rosin Chapel is depicted Mayan pyramids that are carved towards the ceiling in Rosin Chapel. This was in commemoration of the close connection between the Templars and those Nahuatl cultures, the Mayan, the Aztecs, and others in North America. The fact that we find these things from North America carved in Rosin Chapel, and keep in mind, Rosin Chapel was completed by 1420, which was 72 years before Columbus ever sailed to the New World, gives evidence of the fact that the Templars were in fact in the New World prior to Columbus. One then asks, well, how did Columbus fit into all of this? Some have in fact accused Columbus himself as being a Templar. But in fact, Christopher Columbus had figured out that there was something across the Atlantic. He wasn't sure how to get to it. So he went to the Grand Master of the Order of the Temple. His daughter was in a convent, and Christopher Columbus pulled her out of the convent, married her to try to get the maps from her, figured out how to get to the New World. At this point, he went to Portugal, asked them to fund him to go to the New World. The King of Portugal said, well, forget it, because he already knew that there was something over across the Atlantic, because he had been protecting the Templars, and the Templars had a port there in Portugal. And so he had absolutely no reason to support Columbus. He was already working with the Templars to ensure, as they did their travel and their trade with the natives in the new land. So because of this, Columbus, in a fit of rage, said, well, fine, then I'm going to go to your enemy. So that's how Christopher Columbus ended up going to Spain. Well, Spain, with Queen Isabella, of course, she was a devout Roman Catholic. And it was already suspected that there had been holy treasures that had been snuck out of Jerusalem by the Templars and smuggled somewhere. And it was now looking more and more like they had been moved to the Americas. And so Queen Isabella figured, well, in working with the Roman Church, okay, we will fund Columbus and he will go over and he'll find these things. Sure enough, they funded Columbus. Columbus set sail to the New World. Columbus actually put on his sails the Templar cross, thinking it would fool the natives, knowing that the natives would recognize the symbol. And the rest is history. The Columbus did not treat the natives well. He was not a Templar. He was simply trying to deceive. And in fact, even in Christopher Columbus's own ship logs, he wrote about how on one of his trips off the coast of Cuba, his men had stopped at an island and they came across a group of well-armed natives that were all meeting with a bearded white European dressed in a white robe with a Templar cross on it. Things like this is evidence of the fact that the Templars were already in the Americas prior to Columbus, and Columbus was simply trying to catch up. We're going to talk about how the Templars established connections with an obscure group in the Middle East known as the Tawhid Mohidun, better known as the Druze. The Druze were a group that existed primarily in what we would call modern-day Syria, Lebanon, Armenia area, and even a little bit into Turkey. Some people believe they even had Indian influence connected to them. According to their own traditions, the Druze had originally come from Egypt, and that in fact there were certain souls in antiquity who had incarnated in the land of Egypt and learned and developed the sciences there, and that these same souls survived a great flood and had incorporated their knowledge from a pre-civilization inside two pillars. One pillar was designed to withstand water and one was designed to withstand fire. And that the Druze had learned of these arts and sciences and brought them forth into the world and agreed to continue to reincarnate going into the future, finding each other to pass this knowledge on. The Druze had also developed a series of initiation rites where they would initiate their family members into their secret doctrines, which included understanding of gnostic philosophy and alchemy, and a science known as Hermeticism. Hermeticism was a pagan form of Gnosticism in which they celebrated the Greek god Hermes. The Druze adopted the symbol of a five-pointed star of different colors, and each point of this star represented how Gnosis manifested in the world, and they became known as the great builders throughout the Middle East. In fact, even some Druze traditions to this day claim that they were the original builders of King Solomon's temple. The Druze also adopted secret forms of recognition amongst each other, as well as a secret hand grip, which was shared amongst the Templars, and their special greeting in which they would say Mohibin, which means welcome to the loving place, or welcome to the place of the heart in Arabic. It comes from the Arabic word mahaba, which is just means to love in Arabic. So they consider themselves loving people who build their temples at the highest hills and the lowest valleys of places throughout the Middle East. The Templars encountered the Druze and established close friendships with them, which continued to this day, our modern day. Included in the Druze philosophy was their study of Hermeticism and Hermetic texts, in particular the book known as the Corpus Hermeticum, which many people believe had actually been given from the Druze to the Templars, and the Templars passed this text on to the Anjou family of Europe, which eventually published it and gave it to the world. Hermetic philosophy is one in which is taught that all reality is formed within the mind of God. In fact, it's taught that the only way, if God is all that is, the only way that God can create is within his mind, because there's nothing outside of himself. Normally when most people create, they could, for example, if someone does a painting, they have materials outside of themselves that they paint on. Or if you're creating a baby, two people get together and then they produce the baby. But if you're all that exists, there is nothing outside of yourself, and therefore the only way that you could create would be within your own mind. Therefore, it was believed that everything that we think is solid and real and tangible is actually just the thought forms of the Creator. And we are reflections of that Creator. And so just as we can change our own thoughts, in the same way the Creator can change his thoughts, and this brings about changes in the world and the universe itself. Interestingly, this idea is something that's been reinforced in the 20th century by modern physics, who have said that the more they look at the nature of matter, and the more they look at subatomic particles and how they behave, the more it begins to look like we are all living in a consciousness construct, or the matrix of a mind, as opposed to just solid reality. Well, this is something that the Druze texts have been saying for centuries, and it was something that the Templars became exposed to. And of course, this fit in perfectly with the Templars' own gnostic ideas, as well as the ideas of alchemy, which taught that all matter is just energy, and if you change the energy, the vibration of the energy, then you can change the mass. This is really what alchemy was. Well, if that energy was thought energy, was conscious energy, then it was just like thoughts changing into new things. And so this made perfect sense to the Templars. The Druze to this day continue to pass on their Hermetic ideas associated with the writings of Hermes. And it was also believed, in line with this, that Hermes took on different forms in different cultures depending on who you were talking with. And in fact, Hermes was also connected with the Roman Mercury, with the Sumerian Enki, with the Egyptian Thoth or Tahuti, with the Phoenician Tuat. He had many manifestations, and the Druze came to celebrate this, and the Templars learned to celebrate it as well. Even to this day, if you travel to many of the cathedrals, like at Notre Dame in Paris and other places, you'll find depicted Hermes carved onto these cathedral walls. And the reason for this is, again, the Templars were trying to preserve this Hermetic idea. One of the fundamental concepts associated with Hermes was his famed emerald tablet, which stated, "As above, so below." It says its father is the sun, its mother is the moon, the wind carries it in its belly, and its nurse is the earth. And it goes on, and it says, "Through all things have been created through the mind of the One, through the meditation of the One." Again, suggesting that everything was created within the mind of the Creator. And if you come to understand how that mind operates in the universe, then we can understand how the universe itself operates. This was of great value to the Templars, not only in their alchemical operations, but within how they set up symmetry and proportion and architecture in the buildings that they were building. It also tied in directly with their study of astrology. The Templars became interested in how the stars were aligned and how we can reflect the alignment of the stars on temples on Earth. In fact, the very word temple itself comes from how a building is aligned with the stars. You know, Templar comes from temple, and temple actually comes from this word for time, and that the word time related to how the buildings were aligned with the stars and how the stars made progression through the sky. That's what gave us time itself. The Templars were fascinated by this, and they tried to set up an order and a symmetry with their buildings and with the things that they were doing based on this order and this symmetry. The Templars were obsessed with this, and they even believed that this emerald tablet may have been the tablet of testimony alluded to within Genesis, or the Old Testament, in which Moses was actually said to have a number of tablets. The first tablet he brought down, called the Tablet of Testimony, he deemed that the people weren't ready for it. So he smashed it and didn't give it to them. The second set of tablets that he provided then being the Ten Commandments. It's believed that Moses himself was probably an alchemist, studying Hermetic philosophy. In fact, according to the Templar tradition, Moses had been on Mount Sinai, had been learning alchemy, the mystery of the burning bush, the fact that he had this revelation and he came down with soot on his face from working with the ovens, the Athanor ovens, the fact that he was able to burn a golden calf into a white powder. Well, everyone knows gold melts. It doesn't turn into a powder unless you apply alchemical processes to it. These are things that suggested that Moses himself was a student of alchemy, and the Templars were fascinated by this. Even more so, one of the symbols of Hermes, of course, was the caduceus, or the wand of Hermes, which was a wand with two snakes going up it. This wand with two snakes was said to represent, amongst other things, the spinal column and the two lines of energy that move up the spinal column, culminating to the pineal gland, or the pine cone on top of the wand. But it also was said to represent how dualities come together in a third term, how they reconcile in a third term, a middle pillar. This symbolism of the wand or the staff and the serpent became intimately associated with Moses, who himself was said to have been able to turn his staff into a serpent and then back into a staff again, in the manner that the Egyptian priests were able to do. Well, again, these symbols of the staff and the serpent tie in directly to Hermes' wand, which again seems to suggest that it's alluding to this Hermetic tradition, this Hermetic alchemical tradition. And this was something that the Druze were preserving, and it was something that the Templars shared in learning with the Druze. Through further Templar exploration, it was believed that the Templars came across other tablets associated with Hermes, but in the form of Thoth or Tahuti. These became known as the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, the Atlantean. But that is a different story. But it ties into this Hermetic idea, and that the fact that there was this tradition that had come out of Egypt and had been preserved by these different groups. One of the other symbols that the Druze adopted was the symbol of St. George slaying the dragon. This symbol of St. George, they believed, tied in directly to the star Aldebaran in the sky, which was known as the bullseye of Taurus. And they said that there were special cycles associated with this eye, this particular star, and that when it was above the moon, this foretold certain things would happen on the planet. And when it became eclipsed by the moon, that problems arose. In fact, this gave rise to the nursery rhyme that says, "Hey diddle diddle, the cat and the fiddle, the cow jumped over the moon." Well, when the cow was jumping over the moon, this was the constellation of Taurus, going, and the eye of Taurus being Aldebaran, being over the moon, and not eclipse. So good things can happen. Whereas when it's eclipsed, bad things happen in general on the planet, calamities. This was one of the things that the Druze continued to follow. And of course, Aldebaran was associated with St. George on the planet and St. Michael in the heavens. So much so that even to this day, St. Michael and St. George were patron saints amongst the Templars as a result. And this later got incorporated into the dubbing ceremonies of orders like the Order of the Garter within England, in which when someone is knighted in the Order of the Garter, it's done so in the name of God, St. Michael and St. George. And the badge of St. George is something that is intimately associated even with England to this day. But it ties in directly to St. George. Of course, we're having the Red Cross, which was again the symbol of the Templar, and it was associated with this star, Aldebaran. And this is something preserved by the Druze to this day. So if you're traveling in the Middle East and you see a monument for St. George, chances are it was made by a Druze, and there may be a Druze settlement nearby. One of the earliest Grail romances was a story by the name of Parzival, written by Wolfram von Eschenbach. The story of Parzival was written in the early 1200s. The story Parzival specifically states that the Templars are the guardians of the Holy Grail. In fact, in one of the legends associated with Parzival, it says that after the Grail is discovered, that writing appears on a stone that says, "If any Templar should become ruler of a foreign peoples, let him ensure that they are given their God-given rights." Well, the Templars, it says that the Templars were the guardians of this Grail, and that it describes the Grail as a number of different things. One of the things it says is that the Grail is a stone that burns the phoenix to ashes, after which the phoenix comes back renewed, and that this provided life to the Templars who were guarding it. Well, this was, of course, a alchemical metaphor, and it said it helped them to keep from aging. Traditionally, the Grail had a special relationship in that it not only was said to heal the body, but it was also healed the land around it, and that there was this special relationship, an as above, so below relationship, or an as within, so without relationship. And so as the Fisher King, or the king that was in charge of the Grail, was sick, then the land itself became sick. But if the Fisher King was able to be healed by the Grail, then the land itself became healed. Again, this implied a special relationship, this as above, so below relationship, as found in Hermetic texts. Even beyond this, though, if we wanted to emphasize this further, is the fact that one of the main characters in Wolfram von Eschenbach's book Parzival is a character by the name of Trevisrent the Hermit. Well, the word hermit actually comes from Hermes, who was said to be the creator of alchemy, the inventor of the word, and God associated with Hermetic texts. And the word Trevisrent means threefold knower. Well, this Trevisrent being threefold knower is directly in line with what we also find in what was known as the Emerald Tablet of Hermes, where Hermes is referred to as Hermes Trismegistus, which again means the thrice great, or three times great. So This tells us that Trevisan the Hermit is Hermes Trismegistus, the same figure that's found on the Emerald Tablet of Hermes. The Templars were said to live off of this alchemical stone whose essence was most pure, as outlined in the story of Parsifal. However, there are other Grail legends. In fact, there's the legend by Chrétien de Troyes. If we recall that Troyes was actually the area where the Templars first got their rule, and it's also where Rashi of Troyes was the one who had been a friend of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux and had influenced the creation of the Templars. Then we start to see the special place of Troyes in France. And in fact, Troyes itself was an alchemical center within France where the Gnostics would gather. Even more so, the person who wrote this story, Chrétien de Troyes, was the cousin of Catherine de St. Clair, who was in fact Hugh de Payne's wife. If we recall, Hugh de Payne was the first Grand Master of the Templar Order, and his wife was Catherine de St. Clair, and Catherine de St. Clair was the cousin of Chrétien de Troyes. So there was an intimate connection here between the Templars and the Grail legends. There were other mentions of what the Grail was, though, and so we need to look at these other mentions. The Grail also was said to be a platter in which the head of John the Baptist was rested. Well, this was alluding to this Johannite Gnostic tradition that the Templars were preserving, in which they were being nourished from, connected to John the Baptist. One of the other descriptions of the Grail was it was said to be an emerald that fell out of the crown of Lucifer after the war in heaven, and that there was this war in heaven, and Lucifer's this emerald fell out of Lucifer's crown, and it was brought to earth by neutral angels. Well, again, we should point out that the word Lucifer means light bearer. And this emerald that fell out of his crown was believed to be associated with the Emerald Tablet of Hermes. Interestingly enough, the Templar tradition has alluded to the fact that this emerald wasn't actually an emerald, it was a copper acetate, which looks like an emerald. It's crystallized copper, but the name for the ancient alchemical art in ancient Sumer was Graal, Graal. This is the origin of the word Grail, from Graal, which again alluded to the art of doing alchemy in ancient Sumer. This was, again, one of the other things that had been being passed down that the Templars had been exposed to. And if we recall that the Templar equal-armed cross, which they wore on their robes, was exactly identical to the same equal-armed cross that can be found depicted on the Anunnaki of ancient Sumer, who were also doing the Graal science, the science of alchemy. Then we can see a tradition being passed down. This same idea of Graal can be found carved and coded on the Kensington runestone, again alluding to this science that the Templars were preserving. Even beyond all of this, however, was sometimes also referred to as Sangreal. There's another name for it. We find this in Sir Thomas Malory's romances of the Holy Grail, in a chapter of Le Mot d'Arthur, published in the 1400s. But Sangreal can be also broken down as Sang Real, which would be, in fact, mean holy blood. This holy blood had a twofold meaning. On the one hand, it alluded to the holy blood associated with what was known as the blood of Christ, or the alchemical elixir that could be derived from the manna. But on the other hand, it also alluded to the holy bloodline that was believed to have existed connected with Mary Magdalene and Jesus and their lineage that came out of them. So as we can see, there are multiple layers of meaning, especially when we consider that Jesus, again, represented the Christos, or the universal consciousness, and Mary Magdalene represented the Sophia, or the wisdom, and that the marriage of Jesus and Mary Magdalene represented the uniting of the soul to the universal consciousness, and that what came out of that was the fruits of that uniting of the soul to the universal consciousness. So it had both a symbolic and a practical aspect to it. All of these things were being preserved by the Templar tradition and in their philosophies and in their understanding of sacred scripture. And they all tied into the mysteries of the Holy Grail. If we recall that a Grail is a vessel, is considered a vessel. It can be considered a vessel not only of knowledge, but of medicine. And it was believed that when, as in the Grail legends, as someone partook of the Grail, they experienced not only a rejuvenation of the body in terms of with healing, but an awakening of consciousness, a gnosis, a divine experiential knowledge. If this was not enough, the Templars also looked to the fact that within each zodiacal age, there had been clearly different symbols that had been adopted that tied in with the zodiac. So for example, back during the age of Taurus, the religious iconography at the time depicted bull iconography. Isis Hathor was depicted with bull horns. This is the area when Hinduism developed and their celebration of the sacred cow. The burning of the golden calf represented the end of the age of Taurus and going into the age of Aries. And of course, the symbolism of the Aries was the ram. And this is why we see Moses as having been depicted with horns. We also find ram symbolism. The god Amun in ancient Egypt was depicted as a ram with ram horns. Again, representing this age of Aries. And during the end of the age of Aries, this is when Abraham goes to sacrifice the ram, representing the end of the age of Aries. Going into the age of Pisces, the symbolism became the fish. And this was right about the same time, the beginning of the age of Pisces. And of course, Jesus was depicted with the fish, the miracle of the fishes. His disciples were fishermen, just like in the Old Testament during the age of Aries, the priesthood were known as shepherds. In the New Testament, the beginning of Pisces, the symbolism was associated with the fish, and the new priesthood were fishermen. At the Last Supper, the disciples are told to follow the person carrying the water jug into that house to experience the Last Supper. Well, a person carrying a water jug was the symbol of the age of Aquarius. And that vessel carrier to the Templars represented the Grail, represented the mysteries of the Holy Grail. And it was believed that the age of Aquarius that we're going into is in fact the symbolism and the mysteries of the Grail will be revealed. Even more so, during the age of Pisces, the symbol of Pisces was two fish swimming in opposite directions, which represented the two dualities that were at extremes. And we see this in the age of Pisces, where everything was good or evil, black and white, liberal or conservative. It was a time of extreme dualities. But moving into the age of Aquarius, the age of the Grail, the symbolism is two streams flowing together. In other words, you still have two dualities, but they're flowing together. They're reconciling into a third term. The age of Aquarius becomes the age of balance. And in fact, we even see this within the story of Parsifal itself. It has been suggested that even beyond Parsifal, alluding to the Partsuf, which was the Kabbalistic tree, the Partsuf El, the face of God, the Kabbalistic tree, which had two pillars balancing in a third middle pillar. In the same way, we're told in the story of Parsifal that his name comes from meaning to pierce the veil, the valley. In other words, a center point between two extremes. So everything in the age of Aquarius that we're going into is one about balance and finding the third reconciling term between dualities. And this was something that the Templars in their initiation ceremonies and in their secret rites were trying to point their candidates to. This idea of finding balance in their lives and finding balance in the world itself. This became fundamental to the mysteries of the Grail, the Holy Grail itself. So the vessel then of the Grail becomes many things depending on the context in which it's being used. And again, the Templars are associated with the guardians of this Grail. Even in later Grail romances, we find one of the Grail heroes being Galahad. And of course, the symbolism of Galahad is Galahad has a white shield with a red cross on it. Again, this red cross tying in directly not only to St. George, but also to the Templars themselves, because this was the badge and the symbol of the Templars. One of the other fundamental symbols that we find within the Grail legends are the colors of black, red, and white. These were the colors of the Templars, and they were also the colors associated with Atlantis within the stories of Plato. Plato describes Atlantis specifically as tied into these colors of black, red, and white. Black, red, and white were also the colors associated with alchemy. In fact, every alchemical transmutation starts out turning black, and then turning from black to red, and then from red to white. And this repeats itself 3 times 3. So it goes black, red, white, black, red, white, black, red, white to complete the great work within the alchemical tradition. One of the other symbols associated with the Holy Grail, of course, was King Arthur Pendragon. And it should be pointed out that the word Arthur, or Arturos, really meant bear, and it represented the great bear in the heavens, also known as the Big Dipper. Well, every 13,000 years, the Big Dipper unites with the head of Draconis, the dragon constellation. And when it does this, it forms an Arthur head dragon. Arthur and the head of the dragon, or bear head of the dragon. And it should be pointed out that the word Pendragon, Arthur's last name, means head dragon. So Arthur Pendragon is drawing a map how every 13,000 years these things tie in together in the heavens. Well, 13,000 years ago, the last time that this united, where the constellation of the Great Bear united with the constellation of the dragon, was during the time of Atlantis. And this, of course, was a key to these Atlantean mysteries that were also being preserved by the Templars in these legends. We now come to the sad, temporary ending of the activities of the Templar Order after the tragedy that occurred on Friday, October 13th, 1307, where the Templar Order was suppressed. Having to answer to nobody but the Pope, the Templars had power and influence. Even kings owed them money that they had loaned. Because the Templars had set up the first banking systems throughout Europe, specifically to allow pilgrims to travel from Europe down to the Holy Land. A pilgrim could put their money in a Templar temple in, let's say, the area of London, and then not have to worry about traveling to Jerusalem and getting mugged along the way, because they had Templar protection. And then by the time they got there to the Holy Land, they could go to the Templar commandery in Jerusalem and present a certificate to the Templars there, who had their own secret forms of recognition with each other, and could pull the money out of the repository that the Templars had in Jerusalem. So they were moving money around, and this was outside of the reaches of the kings and the church for the most part. This allowed the Templars to grow in influence and power, and it also allowed power to become less centralized amongst the kings and the Pope, and put much power back into the hands of the people. The Templars were very concerned about giving power to the people. They believed that the future destiny, in fact, of civilization involved people becoming empowered as individuals, and that new institutions needed to be formed that weren't subject to the restrictions of dogma and the whims of kings. As a result of all this, the Templars, while being celebrated, were also somewhat resented by the monarchs of Europe, because monarchs would borrow money from them, from the Templars, and then they would owe the Templars this money. And this was particularly the case with a particular French king by the name of King Philip IV, also known as Philip the Fair. He had borrowed money from the Templars. He hoped to borrow a lot more money in order to pay for his future wars that he wanted to do. In fact, King Philip wanted to make himself the war king of Europe, and he knew he needed money to do this, and he was scrambling to try to find ways to do that. Even beyond this, the Roman Church recognized that the Templar order was a power unto themselves. The Templar order had become a multinational corporation that was largely beyond their reach, and so the Pope had hoped to combine the Templar order with the Order of St. John, known as the Knights Hospitalier, in order that they would fall under the Hospitalier rule and therefore be more subservient to the Roman Church. Well, Jacques de Molay, who was the Grand Master of the Templars, did not want to allow this to happen. He wanted to ensure that the Templars had their autonomy, to ensure that they could continue to do their secret work that they were doing around the world, including in the Americas. And the idea of merging with the Hospitalier just did not seem like a good idea at the time, because it would hinder any progress that they were making, not only on behalf of the order, but on the behalf of civilization itself throughout Europe. Philip the Fair quickly realized that the only way he could get the money that he needed in order to A, no longer have to pay back the debts he owed the Templar order, but B, to get the money he needed for the wars that he wanted to wage, was to devise a plan to suppress the Templar order so that he could get access to their wealth. Tied into this was the fact that the Roman Church, of course, was concerned about the fact that the Templars were sitting on treasures and secrets that they suspected had been smuggled out of Jerusalem and were in hiding somewhere. And the Templars and the Roman Church wanted these artifacts from the Templars. Even though the Templars had passed on certain manuscripts and ideas to the Cistercian order, who they were very close with, even the Cistercians themselves were reluctant to turn everything over to the Roman Church that they were said to be a part of. So it caused a real problem, and for the Roman Church and the French king, in order to consolidate power, they had to come up with a plan in order to do it. King Philip the Fair, Philip IV, had an idea on how to do this, and so he tried to influence popes, sometimes through coercion and sometimes through negotiation, to try to wrestle power out of the Templar order. He finally found a pope who was willing to seemed to be willing to help him somewhat in this regard, and this was Pope Clement V. An arrangement was made between Philip the Fair and Pope Clement V that they would suppress the Templar order. King Philip the Fair then initiated arrest orders. He had them drawn up in September of 1307 that suggested within a month the Templar people would be ordered to round up Templars wherever they were and to suppress them and bring them in on charges of heresy. At the time, living in Paris, there were 3,000 Templars. And the Templars, being involved in all aspects of trade and commerce and political discourse, they certainly had friends and allies on all levels. And they quickly came to learn of this secret plan by King Philip IV to suppress them. But they couldn't let anyone know that they knew about this. They had a responsibility to the artifacts that they had in their possession, and they needed to make sure that they didn't fall into the hands of the king or the Pope. Therefore, between September of 1307 and October of 1307, the Templar Order devised a plan under Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master of the Knights Templar, to secretly move all the money from their Paris commandery building, as well as all artifacts, out of France. They had to do this secretly through their boats to move all this stuff out of the Holy Land into their new area in the Americas that they had already been setting up for. But they had to do it in such a way that it didn't appear they were doing it and that they weren't aware of what was coming. Of the 3,000 Templars that were in Paris, the majority of them, almost 2/3 of them, set to work moving everything out of the country on ships, who sailed away, leaving a little over 600 Templars behind to pretend like all was operating as business as usual throughout Paris. One of the people who stayed behind was Jacques de Molay, who, knowing what was going to be coming and that they were likely to all be arrested in October, he had hoped to try to influence their release and to strike some sort of a deal with Philip to ensure the Templar survival. But if the worst should come, if in fact they ended up being executed as a result of being rounded up, at least the majority of the Templars and their artifacts would have been secreted away to other lands into safety. Finally, the date came on Friday, October 13th, 1307. The Philip's troops had their orders to arrest all Templars within France, and a suppression began across France and the rest of Europe to bring in the Templars on heresy charges. Jacques de Molay and over 600 Templars were rounded up. But again, just of Paris, this was 600 of the 3,000 that would have normally been existing in Paris at the time. The Templars were rounded up. They were then tortured for the next 7 years. And by 1312, the Roman Church dissolved their official connections with the Templar order. They issued papal bulls which had declared that the Templar order was no longer under Roman Catholic patronage, and it was, on outward appearances, appeared to be the end of the Templar order. However, much to Philip's dismay, when he raided the Paris Commandery building, he found that all the treasure had been smuggled out, and all of the ships associated with the Templars had already disappeared. Everything that they were looking for, all the money and the holy treasures, had already been smuggled out prior to the Templars being arrested. This infuriated Philip, because the whole reason why he had arrested them was to try to get this money so that he could use it to fuel his wars. And of course, the Roman Church wanted the artifacts that the Templars had been sitting on. As a result, he knew that the only way he had any hope of trying to get any of this was to torture the Templars that they rounded up, to try to force confessions and to get the information that they wanted and to figure out where everything was. The Templars who had been rounded up were forced to confess to all kinds of false things, including heresy charges. And they were accused of worshiping an idol known as the Baphomet. Many Templars did recount that they had secret initiation ceremonies. They were accused of trampling on the cross and of spitting on the cross, as well as having obscene, what were deemed to be obscene kisses during their initiation ceremonies, and of worshiping a head known as the Baphomet. This word Baphomet has now been, as many scholars have pointed out, just comes from the Greek words meaning baptism of wisdom, Baphometus, which was alluding to their gnostic doctrines, as we discussed, also associated with the Grail legends. However, the word Baphomet, when you also apply what's known as the Atbash cipher to it, which is a coded cipher for the Hebrew language, the word Baphomet actually gets converted to the word Sophia, which of course means wisdom and was the goddess of wisdom, again associated from their secret Gnostic doctrine that they were passing on. Even more so, if we apply this word to Arabic, we get Abapholameh, which means father of wisdom. And some people have said that this was associated with, in fact, with their celebration of King Solomon or of Hermes himself. Though it should be pointed out that the Templars were also studying and celebrating Pythagorean doctrines. And so Pythagoras was also considered the father of wisdom within the Templar tradition. And so many people believe the bearded idol that was being celebrated within the Templar temples was actually an image of Pythagoras. It was also ordered that other kings throughout Europe suppress the Templars as well. And while some reluctantly agreed to it, others didn't agree to it at all. There were some kings like Robert the Bruce in Scotland who he was already excommunicated by the Roman Church, He had no interest in working with the Roman Church and taking orders from them. So he had no problem with not suppressing the Templars that were living in his area. Other kings, like King Edward of England, resisted for long periods of time to even round up any Templars. And when he finally did, he really had no interest in torturing them or getting confessions out of them. But he did imprison them. In other areas, which are now places like Switzerland, the Templars were able to largely hide out without much problems. And in Portugal, they weren't rounded up at all. They continued to just exist as they had been existing. And to get around the order to round up Templars, the order just changed its name in Portugal to the Knights of Christ instead of the Poor Knights of Christ of the Temple of Solomon. And in so changing their name, they were technically, not any Templars anymore under that name in Portugal, so they didn't need to round any up. This culminated in March of 1314 with the sentencing of Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master of the Templars, to be burnt at the stake, along with several other Templars, including Geoffrey de Charnay, the preceptor of Normandy. Right before Jacques de Molay was burnt at the stake, he recanted his confessions. He said that all Templars were innocent of the charges against them, and he warned that Philip the Fair and Pope Clement V would both join him before God within a year. Jacques de Molay, along with Geoffrey de Charnay and other Templars, were then burnt at the stake in front of Notre Dame Cathedral. And to this day, there's still a plaque there commemorating the death of Jacques de Molay. They were burnt in front of Notre Dame Cathedral because, of course, they had helped to build this cathedral. They put their stonemasons had built it up, and so it made sense to Our Lady, who also represented Sophia and Isis, was the last thing that Jacques de Molay saw as he was being burnt at the stake. Roman Church officially declared this being the end of the Templar order. And in their view, it was the end of the Templar tradition. And they wanted the public to know this. He right before Jacques de Molay had died, while he was in his prison cell, he got the word out because they already knew that the suppression was coming prior to him being rounded up. They had plans in place for the order to survive and for the lineage to continue to be passed on. One of the places that the Templars managed to survive was in Germany, particularly in the Württemberg area near Tübingen. Here in the Black Forest, they were able to hide out and work within families within the region to secure their independence, to continue to do their work. Slowly, they reorganized themselves, reconstituted what they were doing, had certain Templar families that worked together, began to call themselves under a new name. This new name was the Militia Crucifera Evangelica. One of the main luminaries within this tradition by the late 1500s, was a guy by the name of Simon Studion. And he actually wrote a book called the Neometria, which was dedicated to the Militia Crucifera Evangelica. This book, Neometria, which means measurement of the temple, or holy measurement, is a description of King Solomon's temple, and it examines King Solomon's temple and what all of the different measurements and everything else, how they may allude to Kabbalistic, alchemical, and gnostic understanding. All the sciences that the Templars had found and preserved during their times of activity. These were incorporated into this 2,000-page book. At the time of the writing of this book, Frederick, the Duke of Württemberg, was the Grand Master of the Order of the region. And there were other luminaries who were also a part of this order, including Queen Elizabeth I. We're talking almost 200 years after the suppression of the Templar Order, where it had gotten reestablished and was thriving within the region. Other luminaries that were attracted to and involved in this work include Sir Francis Bacon of England and Johann Valentin Andrea of this area of the Black Forest. In fact, Johann Valentin Andrea lived in the town of Kolf, where his mother was the town alchemist. And they continued to perpetuate the Templar rites and privately or secretly underground and continued to do their work within the region. Tübingen became an important center for this, and a very important Stift or school was established in this region, which later became the home of such important people as Johannes Kepler and others. This particular movement also had gotten involved heavily with what was to become the 30 Years' War in the region, which unfortunately was a very bloody war between Protestant and Catholic factions. In fact, it's been argued that when Martin Luther started the Protestant Reformation, he nailed his theses to the door on October 13th, the very date that only years before had the Templar persecutions had begun. And Martin Luther, while he had his own ideas, it's interesting to point out that his personal emblem, his personal seal that he would use on documents was a rose with a cross in the center of it. Well, the rose cross were clear signs of the Templar tradition. This was something that the Templars had been using clear back into the beginning of the Templar Order. Again, the Templars had said that their tradition had largely come from Ras Tau, which was the ancient name for Giza, and the symbol for Ras, again, could mean rose, and Tau means cross. Therefore, the rose cross became a symbol for the secret knowledge that had come from Giza in Egypt. Out of this whole region, only within 15 years later, there was new manifestos that began to come out of the region, announcing a new secret order that called itself the Order of the Rose Cross, or the Order of the Rosicrucianism, or the Rosicrucian Order. The first of these was issued in 1614 under the name of the Fama Fraternitatis, and it announced the secret order established by a figure known as Christian Rosicrucius. The next one, the next year in 1650, was another one called the Confessio, which said that the goals of the order included the study of alchemy and the regeneration of mankind. There were clear Kabbalistic references in it, and it encouraged anyone who was interested in bettering mankind to make themselves known through their works by publishing, and that they would be contacted by this secret society. The third manifesto that was published was a book called The Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosicrucius, and was largely believed to be written by Johann Valentin Andrea. The first two, some people believe, were actually written by Sir Francis Bacon, though there are different accounts of this. What we do know is that these manifestos that describe this great secret society have all the hallmarks of pointing to, again, underground Templars organizing things. Even Christian Rosicrucius himself is described as wearing a white tunic with a red equal-armed cross over the shoulder, the very symbol of the Templars. When the Roman Church saw this, they were terrified because they knew that the Templar order was resurfacing. And they went to work right away trying to suppress it and to round up anybody who they believed to potentially be a Rosicrucian. The Roman Church at the time, as well as monarchs in the region, were terrified that the Templar order was reorganizing itself and coming back with this announcement of the Fama, the Confessio, and the chemical wedding of Christian Rosicrucius. The chemical wedding of Christian Rosicrucius in particular was an alchemical doctrine which described alchemical operations that had been developed centuries earlier by the Templars, and they were trying to get it out somewhat to the public. At this point, people were very concerned about this Rosicrucian order and what influence it may have on Europe. But by their own account, all they wanted to do was develop new technologies and get Europe out of the Dark Ages. They believed that they had the means and both with medicine and with technology and with spiritual perception to change the course of Europe. It has been suggested that this underground Templar body, now calling itself Rosicrucianism, also had a huge influence on another group that was underground at this time, which was forming at this time, which was known as Freemasonry. Freemasonry, as we talked about, as underground Templars one of the places they had gone to survive was to form Masonic guilds, guilds of stonemasons. In fact, we know that clear back as within the 1500s, these underground Templars were building things and leaving their marks with the symbol of the square and compasses. This symbol had been used earlier by the Templars. It was found in the earliest Templar commandery in Constantinople, the former Church of St. Sergius and Bacchus, where Hugh de Paynes and Godfrey de St. Omar had been initiated, in which we find a square and compasses next to an Egyptian ankh, which still resides to this day. But we also find marks of it being found even at the Tower of London, in which right on the street level, in the cobblestone streets that were laid clear back in the 1500s, we find this same square and compasses being put in the streets. And within 100 years, by 1598 in Scotland, there was under King James, there was a statutes known as the Shaw Statutes. It was named after William Shaw, who was forming guidelines for Masons in the region. And it alluded to signs and grips, something that had been found within the Templar tradition. This had all the hallmarks of the Templar tradition, and the very fact that in 1598 we have both the Neometria being published in Germany and the Shaw Statutes being released in Scotland shows some level of organization happening between the two. All of this started to be structured even more. Ultimately, this structure gave rise to what was to become known as Freemasonry. And in fact, even to this day, the degrees of Freemasonry and the initiations of Freemasonry have all of the hallmarks of the early Templar initiations. including some of the secret words and grips that are used within the Masonic fraternity.